For some reason, if you're this color, that's what is supposed to be your story, regardless of whether you was born here or not. And that is a problem, because what that does is it gives us a false sense of inferiority, and it gives another people a false sense of superiority. When these people that they talk about who are Native Americans and Grand Chieftains today, talking about the ones that's opening the casinos and all this other stuff, they are all descendants of people from Tartary. And how can we prove this? This is because way back in the days, there was an empire in ancient China called the Qiang Dynasty. And the Qiang decided, under a man named Hu Xian, another Moor, decided to come over here and find their cousins, who they referred to as the Western Ixi, or Ixe, or Yi. And so when they came here, they found an Olmec here that was already here from time immemorial. Olmec here that was already here from time immemorial. Olmec here that was already here from time immemorial.
Yesterday was about the culture of the Olmecs actually preceding the Mayas.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that?
Sure. They even are called pre-Mayas. Olmecs, some of their cities found in La Venta, Veracruz, Mexico. Some of them probably here on the Pacific coast to Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Mayan civilization, as I said, is a sort of a cultural unification. Even some cultures came from the other side of the ocean. Some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs. Even some cultures came from the other side of the ocean. Some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs. Even some cultures came from the other side of the ocean. Some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs. And they are considered probably the roots of the Africans because of the negroid features on their big heads that were left around. Mm-hmm. And actually in the Pacific coast of Guatemala, we have a city known as Abactacalic or Tacalicabaj, and actually it's sort of the link between the Mayas and the Olmecs. The Mayan civilization is sort of a overlapping of cultures. We're going to talk something about it here, especially of the Teotihuacans. It's a good example of it.
And they both merged their culture. When that culture merged together, they became one people. And then out of that people, we get the people today we call the Hopi, the Anasazi, the so-called Pueblo cultures, and all of that, right? It wasn't until maybe 16,000 years later, when the Hindus was exiled from India by the Sindhi Moors, or the Moors from Old Bombay and all of that, kicked them out. After the Hindu invasions, they all was brought over in boats and brought over here. When they came here, they then mixed with the so-called Autochthon or Aboriginal people who were already here, and then those Aboriginal people allowed them to stay in a certain area, and they adopted them into certain aspects of the culture. This is where you get people called the Mixtecs and the Zapotecs and the Toltecs and these type of people. They were all descended from the Olmecs. Now the Olmec people, the original constituency, started to move further up. They started to move further up from La Venta, Palenque, Chichen Itza, and move further up into what we would now call the Midwestern United States, and then further, and then after a certain amount of time, they dwelled there and then started to disperse into sub-tribes and nations. Some of those sub-tribes and nations, one of the biggest one was called the Yamasee. I don't know if any people saw the movie Apocalypto, but in that movie there was a blue dye that they were painting the people who were going to be sacrificed in. That blue dye actually comes from red clay that's found in Georgia, the red clay in Georgia. And it was an old custom that the queens would ingest some of the red clay in Georgia because it would help with the magical properties that they were trying to pass on to the babies. And a lot of Autochthon people still do that to this day. So what happened was the Yamasee Nation basically... What had happened was the Yamasee Nation established themselves in what we call Georgia and all that. And then one of the sub... And then one of the... I'm sorry.
And one of the sub...
And then one of the sub-nations called the Southern Cree and then the Northern Creek decided to go against and fight the Yamasee. There was a big war between that, and then the Yamasee basically lost the war, and their women were then brought in as squaws, meaning captured queens, to populate with the Cree, the Northern Cree, and the Southern Creek. And once they had those babies, that became another nation now. That nation was then known as the Seminole. And then the Seminole were then given land back down in what we right here call Al Andalusia.
When some cultures came from the other side of the ocean, some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs. When some cultures came from the other side of the ocean, some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs. When some cultures came from the other side of the ocean, some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs.